Have you ever wondered what it is about reaching for our dreams that feels so hard and requires so much of our own healing? Are you curious about how moving towards your own creativity might heal what's making you feel stuck? Well, that is why we made this show. I'll be having conversations with emotional health experts as well as artists, musicians, and creatives, all with the intention of resourcing and inspiring you to uncover your true creative self. I'm Courtney Lancaster, and this is the Heal Create podcast. Hey, welcome, Laura. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am so excited to have you. I love Laura so much. If you don't know who she is, Laura Duncan is a life consultant that created an emotional healing modality called the compassion method, which basically teaches people, well, actually, how would you describe it?
I would say the compassion method is kind of like multiple part process of being able to connect with your heart and being able to take care of the pain or unmet need in order to give yourself compassion and then to be able to be reconnected with your true self.
That's a perfect explanation. So I met Laura a few years back as a client. I came to her because I was just drowning in so much anxiety and trauma, and I had no idea where to start. And so I often say that Laura taught me self-compassion from scratch. So I was a client of yours for a few years, and then I interned for you and did a lot of really fun stuff around the compassion method. And I just really was able to integrate it deeply, and then worked with you, and then kind of started off on my own. But you are, I've said this to lots of people, one of my favorite people. And to talk to about this kind of stuff, one of my favorite people to learn from. And is there anything else you can kind of tell us about yourself, about this thing that you've created?
Yeah. So the compassion method was birthed from my husband passing away 13 years ago. And so going through that grief and pain with children, because I have 4 kids. And at the time they were really young, and I wanted them to be able to process pain in a successful way in order to be able to, live a life of, full life. And statistically, when you go through grief and you go through loss and you don't know how to process it, you end up usually going into addiction, going into different lifestyle behaviors that were things that I wanted my kids to be able to overcome and not have to go down those paths. And so really learned it for myself first, learned it for my kids, and then opened it up to the world, because the whole world is in pain, whether it's a loss like a death or a different type of loss. We all have pain. We all have grief. And like you were saying, there's so many of us that don't even know where to begin. We don't even know what to do with it. We just know something is not right, because we instinctively all know we have this big ball of pain that we don't know what to do with. And so we don't know. And so we're just stuck in it. And that's kind of where I started too, of like, something is not right. I don't know what it is, even though it seems very obvious, and I don't know what to do with it. And that's where the compassion method was birthed, of learning what to do with pain.
Which is pretty incredible that this was all something that you've developed yourself through trial and error, and that you've really kind of cultivated through your own experience and then through your experience with helping other people. And I think that, like you said, unfortunately, it was birthed by, I think, some of the deepest grief anyone could imagine, or some of the most painful circumstances anyone could imagine. And I hope it's okay for me to say it like this, but it was really hopeful to hear your story in the beginning of my journey, to hear somebody who had gone through, again, some of the worst circumstances that I can imagine, and truly thriving.
Yeah.
Learning how to connect more deeply to yourself. You've talked a lot about the gifts that came after losing Jeff, your husband, and how you've been able to share those with the world. And I think that when you're in such deep anxiety, there's a lot of things that you'll believe, like the world is a terrifying, scary place. I can't handle if horrible things happen to me. I'll never, feel better. I'll never be okay. And your story has been, I think, so inspiring to so many people. because you did walk into the darkness and you've walked out of it.
And honestly, more joy, more peace, more hope, more purpose, more creativity, more than I even had before I walked through the death. And there really is something about life on the other side of it that unfortunately a lot of us get stuck in that doorway in between, where we just get stuck in the pain and we don't know how to walk through it. When you walk through it, beautiful things happen in the wake of death. And I think it has been such a beautiful journey. So much so that it's kind of strange. We're like, of course, if I could have Jeff back, I would. But it's kind of strange in a way because I've received so much from it. Like part of me is like, could I go, like would I go back? Like it's a weird thing because so much good has come from it that I'm like, I wouldn't want to lose everything, even though I would obviously want him to still be in my life. So it's just amazing to not only be okay, but to be thriving, joyful, peaceful, just really, I love life. I feel like I have like the best life in the whole world. And most people, when they hear my story, they're like, are you sure? And I'm like, yep, I got the best life.
I can attest to that. Laura sounds so sweet and so like kind, and she's so nurturing. She's like my craziest friend.
I do have a lot of
the things that you say, the situations you get yourself in, you are a true like lover of life. And it's evident in just being in your presence. Okay. So like I said, I feel like you taught me self-compassion from scratch. I feel like you did teach me self-compassion from scratch. And I'm curious if you could go to the very basics of self-compassion as if you were teaching it to somebody who had no idea how to apply it or what it was. Where would you start?
Yeah. So really, ultimately, it goes back to your early childhood development, because that's where we learn the building blocks or the lack of building blocks of self-compassion. And so I always go back to those the roots of when we were meant to know it and we didn't. And so when we go to self-compassion, it's the impact of self-compassion is profound, but the process of it is actually pretty simple. But it's like this hurdle that I personally had to overcome because self-compassion was difficult for me as well. And for many people, self-compassion can just feel, fake or not real or not really connecting to your heart, or like sympathy or pity. And so there's a lot of kind of resistance to it that I felt within myself. And as I help people walk through it, I've seen resistance in others because we don't understand really what it is. And if you took self-compassion down to just the basis, it's the ability to be with yourself, and specifically to be with yourself in your pain. And it's not fixing, it's not changing, even though as a byproduct things change, and as a byproduct problems that we've had get solved and they get fixed. But the whole basis of it is to be with. And it's an extraordinary thing because we spend lots of our life trying not to be with ourselves. And we know that by how we speak to ourselves, because it's really your self-talk. And unfortunately, how we talk about ourselves is really sad in a lot of ways. Most people not only don't know self-compassion, but they have a really strong level of self-hatred or self-dislike or self-indifference, which is all forms of self-hatred. And so here we are talking trash about ourselves all the time, talking horrible, impatient, unkind, forcing, pushing, what's wrong with you. And that's our constant dialogue. So imagine being in a relationship, that you're married, and if your husband was always saying those things to you, it would hurt your heart. And so we're hurting our hearts. And then even more than the negativity, it's the lack of being with, the lack of knowing ourselves. Self-compassion opens up that door to know yourself in your deepest pain, which then allows you to know yourself in your truest self as well.
Why do you think that self-compassion is essential for someone that is in a healing season?
So compassion actually is a healing agent. Like it carries healing properties to it. And so when we're going through anxiety, like you said, or depression, or whatever pain, or however pain is manifesting in our lives, we need to actually bring healing to it. And the healing comes through almost like, I kind of like to say that compassion is like a balm. It's like putting ointment on a wound. And as that ointment is applied to that wound by intentionally and consistently being with ourselves in compassion, it literally heals our brains. It heals our hearts. It starts to help us wire and process different because we no longer have that pain as a barrier or a catalyst for us to go into that triggered reaction of anxiety or depression. I've really grown to love anxiety and depression. I know it sounds so strange because we're all trying to avoid it, but I just love it as a messenger and the opportunity it creates for comfort and compassion to come in and be with us in a way that if we didn't have that blaring anxiety or depression getting our attention, we wouldn't be able to go to those deeper places to apply that healing compassion.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would totally agree. I would never have been able to say that in the thick of it. So definitely sending so much understanding and compassion to those that are really in the thick of it, because it can feel so incredibly painful and miserable. However, I would agree with you on this side of it. Like, our bodies are so brilliant. Our hearts are so brilliant in the way that they get our attention. Anxiety is kind of funny in that it's protecting us from our emotional pain using lots of intrusive thoughts and images. And it's all kind of projecting this sense of separation that self-compassion actually heals. And it's the opposite of. One of my favorite teachers of anxiety, her name is Cheryl Paul. She says, anytime you believe the lies that anxiety is telling you, you abandon yourself. And she's not saying it in a shaming way, but in the way that, like, if a child came to you and said, I hate myself, and you were like, well, yeah, maybe you should change yourself. Maybe you are the worst. that would be complete abandonment of your child's experience. And we wouldn't believe any of the things that our child says that have to do with huge fears or self-hatred or, anything that isn't like love and connection. We wouldn't believe them. We also wouldn't totally ignore them. A good parent wouldn't ignore the fearful or insecure or self-hatred thoughts coming from their child. Ideally, they would be with them. And that is what creates attachment and connection with a parent and child. And then also that's what self-compassion does now for us as adults walking through healing. You'll probably remember working with me that my biggest issue as a creative was the wild stories and lies. And I mean, lies just as in, like, not somebody's telling me lies, but just the untruths that would come from this brain and this body that were really, really freaking out. I didn't know how to be with myself. And so my brain, which is what anxiety does, your brain will try and distract you with so many big, giant stories. And being a creative, I think so many of us really struggle with, like, the intrusive thoughts are way wilder, way crazier than they would be otherwise.
Remember how we were talking about imagination, and we were at one point you were saying, sharing in a very kind way. I was just saying, like, you really have like an active imagination. and I feel like it goes along with what you're saying of, when you're a creative, like a big part of where we create from is our imagination, which is beautiful in that, in that creative, inspired place, but the same exact imagination that brings inspiration and, produces beautiful, creation is also the part that says, I'm imagining these realities to be true. So which means that you're living them as if they're true.
Oh my gosh. It's so common now that I work with clients too. I do have so much compassion for those that are really struggling with absolutely illogical fears that feel so true.
So tangible, so real. And from the outside in, you can be like, that's ridiculous. But it feels so true, as if it's this, desk right in front of me right now. It feels that tangible.
Yeah. And that was something that I really like. You would tell me, like, that's actually from, your imagination that's coming from, like, you're really scared. This is fear. And I'm like, no. Like, I don't have time for the emotions right now. Like, this thing might actually happen to me. And, like, what am I going to do? Not realizing that that's actually how anxiety works. That's how anxiety tries to distract you from your felt experience.
Exactly. And it creates such a profound illusion that we get stuck in it.
Yes. Which brings me to my next question. Can you explain triggers from scratch?
Yeah. So again, in my beginning of my journey, I studied a lot of the neuroscience behind emotions and grief. And a big part of that is triggers. Triggers has become kind of such a buzzword and kind of overused. And, I feel like it's kind of lost a little bit of its kind of the wealth that's there when we actually understand it. So that's why I like to take it down to really simple explanation, but still pairing it with the neuroscience. So ultimately, when we're in a triggered state, is we go into our amygdala, which is that fight or flight, freeze, fawn part of our brain. And I also call it, and so does the psychology world, calls it our child brain or a primal brain. And so when we go into that place, we are really actually going back to being a child. And when you are in your adult brain, which is your sophisticated frontal lobe, you're able to be connected to your true self. You're able to reason. You're able to strategize. You're able to see resources and solutions and help. But when we're in our triggered brain, which is our child brain, we're in that fight, that freeze, that flight, or that fawn that causes us to go back to how we thought as a child. And that child brain thinks it's all or nothing. It's life or death. There's no solutions. It's always going to be this way. It's never going to change. And in that brain, we start to process life. And some people live in a perpetual state of being triggered. And it may vary in its intensity, but people stay in that. So that means that the lens that they are perceiving their world is coming directly from the part of their brain that's going to see things like a child does. So being able to recognize that when we're triggered, we're no longer connected to our creative, inspired, beautiful part of our brain. This is actually hijacked and shut down. And now we are functioning from that primal child brain.
Yeah, which we want to escape at all costs if it wasn't safe for us to be a child with emotions in the first place.
Exactly. Yep. And that's where we don't choose self-compassion because we don't want to be with ourselves in that part of our brain. We just want it to suppress it and have it go away so we can go back to being creatives. And of course, we want to be creatives. Of course, we want to live inspired, beautiful lives. But the suppression and the ignoring of that very important process that we go to when we get triggered causes us to actually have bigger reactions and bigger triggers because you can't stop a trigger by getting better. You can only have a trigger stop by giving compassion. It's the only way. You can't tell a kid, just don't cry like that. You have to go and you have to hold the child and be with the child until they feel safe enough to be able to stop crying. And that's what gets missed with triggers because triggers look like an enemy to us because they bring such uncomfortable feelings and emotions and thoughts to us that we think it's an enemy. But really, triggers are a friend. They're an opportunity that's saying, hey, we've got a lot of pain that you've been ignoring for a long time. Can we get some help over here? And when we start to actually listen, our triggers don't have to get so loud.
Yes. And I know that you and I have talked about this. We don't have to go deep into it, but coming from an evangelical background where there is, a lot of information around the enemy and all of its forces that are trying to take you out. That was my only context for pain. And for so many people in my position, the imagination of what is actually happening when you're experiencing that level of discomfort combined with a lifetime of hearing about a force of darkness that's trying to take you out.
And it sure feels like it in the moment.
It sure does. It absolutely does. My imagination around what was going on was so unhelpful to my healing process and really kept me from knowing how to be with myself. So on that point, when your imagination kind of takes over and your triggers become amplified and so much bigger, how do you walk clients through using their imagination to actually do the opposite, which is bring peace and comfort and compassion to their system?
Yeah, so I kind of look at it and we have a fantasy imagination and we have a vivid imagination. And so our fantasy imagination is just based on whatever we perceive to be real. It's not based on reality. Where vivid imagination is based on reality, which means that it's coming from real experiences with real people that we are reconnecting to help bring peace, comfort, compassion, nurture to those places in our hearts that are getting triggered because of a wound. And
Mhm.
so what I do is I help people to look through their whole entire lives to find people in their lives that they've truly experienced feeling comfort from, tangibly, real person. I mean, even think right now, like the last time you got one of those really good hugs and just like what it felt like the weight of it and the comfort of it and the warmth and that just connection. Like I'm thinking right now of a hug I got recently and I'm like, oh, you can just
Mhm.
feel it. My aunt gave me a hug and I could just feel it. And it was long
Mhm.
and it was sweet and it was tender. And when I take that real vivid imagination that's remembering 5 days ago when she gave me the hug, and I take it and I put it on my heart, I put it on my child brain, my amygdala, it brings peace into those places that are hurting. And
Mhm.
it's such a beautiful way to use your imagination because you're actually connecting to real experiences just being reapplied versus the fantasy imagination is just connecting to anything that we could possibly be thinking about, positive or negative. It's just connecting
Mhm.
to anything. It's not actually connecting to real people and real experiences.
Right. Like it's your imagination outside of your control.
Yeah, it doesn't have any substance to it. It doesn't have stability to it. It's just
Yeah.
kind of like, um, one day my prince will come and he'll ride in on a horse and he's going
Sure.
to pick me up and we're going to go off into the
The
sunset. And
rescue
we're going to
trope,
live
right?
happily ever after. Exactly. And that's usually the fantasy imagination that we're connecting to. And that will make my trigger go away and that will make my pain go away because I'll now have this imaginary hero to come and be with me. But I don't know any princes. I know
Mhm.
they're out there, but I don't know any princes. I haven't had anyone, a real person, be with me in that way. So now it leaves an emptiness because I'm still waiting for this imaginary person to come. And I still don't have the comfort and nurture I needed even back to early childhood development.
Right. The other thing that I'm always interested in and nerding out in is like your nervous system and your body and how your body's like
I know you
experiencing
explain
life.
it so well. I always love it.
Well, anything that I explain well has been explained to me well, but what they call it from the polyvagal standpoint is it's called being the active operator of your nervous system as opposed to your nervous system operating you. Your state creates your story. So whatever state you're in, if you're not conscious of what's going on, it's going to create a whole narrative for you that will feel true. So if I feel really triggered by my spouse and I'm not aware of what a trigger
Mm-hmm.
is, that you're going back in time
Yeah.
and reliving your childhood, if I'm really
Mm-hmm.
triggered by my spouse and I feel like really like fight or flight, then my narrative that might get created is that, gosh, I married the wrong person, or he's the worst, or he needs to get his own healing, and we're just not compatible, or like,
Yeah.
whatever. Your story will just go on ahead and create its own, its own.
Mhm.
It's trying to make sense of what's going on based on your trigger. Which
Yeah.
is why it's so important to know who your true self is so that when you're not that person, your true self is the version of you that is calm, curious, creative, compassionate, inspired, joyful, you on your hopeful and good days. When you're not that person, that would indicate that you're triggered. And that's when we stop listening to the story, which is a mistake that I made for years, which is why my
Mhm.
life felt so confusing because my story
Yeah.
changed every day. And
Yeah.
so, what you're talking about is when you notice that you're triggered, using the power of your imagination. And this takes practice and work to do, but using the power of your imagination to imagine comfort, compassion, kindness, get curious about what the trigger might be about, and bring the compassion in via, even if they're tiny, tiny memories of being connected to or loved. Does that feel right? What am I missing?
I like how you explain that and how you're connecting to it. And that's exactly it. I like to look at it too. It's like my child brain. Like, I love my kids and I know you love your kids and like, but I don't always like, I believe what their perception is the reality.
Mm.
So I do believe them. But when they come up with very elaborate, imaginative type things, I'm not going constantly like, oh, well, then they're going to do that for sure. And like, oh no, I better stop this because one day they're going to grow up and they're going to be a astronaut and that's not realistic and they're probably not going to be an astronaut. Like you have all these things that you want to like reason and figure out. But I know that like it's great they want to be an astronaut, and if it doesn't work out they'll find something else and it will be okay. So you start to kind of, you look at more of like a child talking to you, that you don't believe everything they say in the literal sense. You believe their emotions, you believe how they perceive it, but you don't believe everything they say in the literal sense because they're in their imagination and it's not going to be necessarily the reality of the situation.
Totally. I just had a situation with my youngest son that made me laugh, privately later on. But we just moved to a new city and he started at a new school. And, it's scary to start in a new school when you're just a little kid.
Scary for us too.
Yeah, it's right. Exactly. And the night of his first day of school, he was going to sleep and he's like, I hate this school. I don't know anybody. I ate lunch by myself and I hate it here and I hate everything. And this is what he said. He said, he was like, Mom, if you want me to grow up to be the meanest person and to be a bully to everyone, then you're going to keep me at this school.
No, I won't.
All right, I know, and it's a great example. Like if I was like,
no, it is. No, it's a great.
Oh God, example. Really? Okay,
yeah.
You know what? Then we better pull you out of this school. But that was his projection of how he felt. He felt it's very threatening to be in a new situation as a little kid. He felt very scared. He did not like his experience at school. So his brain, brilliantly trying to protect him from a painful future, projected the worst thing that could happen into the future.
Exactly.
And he believed that story to be true. And it was my job as a parent to not believe that story and to instead give him compassion and hug him and encourage him and attune to where he's at. And that is what you're teaching in the compassion method is you're teaching adults how to do that for themselves.
Exactly. And that's what really starts, you start to see that shift happening. I remember even for myself personally, like there's certain characteristics. I have my clients do an exercise where they like observe their triggered self. They feel what they're physically feeling, what they're mentally thinking, what they're emotionally feeling. And then you start to kind of see a pattern in it because triggers are very repetitive and they usually have very similar components to it. They vary a little bit depending on the circumstance and where we're at emotionally. But for the most part, there's common threads through our triggers. And one of my common threads when I was triggered was hopelessness. I would just feel this like utter hopelessness, like it was the end of the world. I was never suicidal. I never wanted to harm myself or anything like that. But I would just deflate. I'd have no creativity. I'd have no ability to see options, solutions. It would just be hopeless, deep hopeless, capital H, hopeless. And when I started to observe my triggered self, I started recognizing whenever I feel hopeless, that is not my true self because my true self hopes and believes for everything and anything. It's who I am. I am hope. But when I feel hopeless, I know I'm no longer in my sophisticated adult true self brain. I know I'm in my child brain. It's like a little check engine light that has hopeless on the check engine. It's like hopeless. And I'm like, oh, I'm in that brain. Because my brain tells me I'm not in that brain. My brain tells me it's true. It's all hopeless. But now I have like these like key words that help me. So whenever I feel hopeless, I'm like, oh, wait a second. I'm not in my brain anymore. I mean, not in my true brain anymore. I need to take care of my child self because I've gone into a hopelessness that's very little and small and can't see past what's happening in front of me.
That's right. That's so true. I actually had something this year, not to like take it into deep pain, but we did lose a lot of family members in my family. So over the last year, we lost my uncle and then my grandma and then my uncle's widowed wife passed away. And it was like so many funerals combined with, we moved 10 hours south and I was huge changes. And I'm doing my thing, I'm parenting, I'm doing my business. And then we had a friend pass away in a really, really tragic way. This is just about a month and a half ago. And I was like, I'm fine. I'm good. I'm fine. And then after like a couple days after that, I noticed that my thoughts were getting really swirly and very intrusive. And I was like, what? And I know this well enough to know like, this is not real and true. So it didn't pull me all the way under, but I didn't realize that I wasn't quite catching up to all the grief and change that had happened over the last year. And I was just, forward focused. And so I think like for every night after that, I like cried and held myself for just not like like I had to stop my life. But every night I think I cried for like a good half hour to an hour for 2 weeks straight after that. And I feel and felt so much lighter and so much more clear and at peace and present, and didn't even realize that I wasn't in that state necessarily, because I was just going and going. And I think that's something that can happen to a lot of people. But my default setting kind of showed up a little bit, which is like, we're fine, keep going. And I have gotten into some bad places in the past with that. It was really helpful for me to be like, oh, this is still my default setting, but it didn't like take me out. I have what I need, and I was able to administer a self-compassion and just be with myself. And I think that's really common for a lot of people.
Yeah. That's why when I say that triggers are an opportunity, they really are an opportunity.
Yeah.
Like they are an opportunity to take care of ourselves, because all of us are avoidant of pain. And so that leads to personal neglect, self-neglect. And until something's loud enough and uncomfortable enough and gets our attention, like those intrusive thoughts or the hopelessness with myself or whatever it is that causes you to go into that triggered place, you're able to recognize, hey, I've neglected myself.
Yes.
But if we just go along and being fine and not having any triggers and having no reactions, then we actually continue to suppress until we have a deep emptiness inside of us, because we didn't learn how to hear the message that the trigger is trying to tell us, so that we can cry, so that we can get comfort, so we can be with ourselves. And that's why I love it's like a reminder. It's like a calling back to saying, hey, come on, let's come on back, because we actually are hurting really bad right now and we're not fine. And I love that triggers are saying that. They're saying, no, this is the reality. We're not okay. And then you were able to so lovingly come in and give yourself the space to grieve and the space to be comforted. And I just love that a trigger led you there.
Totally. And I think it was even a good lesson for me to realize I don't have to wait for it to get that intense. And it wasn't. So in the past, 5-6 years ago, I would have like, and this actually did happen, those kinds of like feelings and thoughts would come up and I believed them, which so many of us do. That is an absolute miserable suck you down to the bottom place. But I didn't believe, I was able to obviously not believe them. And it was only a couple days of that kind of like intense feeling that made me go, oh gosh, I really have I need to sit with this. Like I would sit with a friend who is hurting. I need to sit with this. And a lesson of like, I can like pay attention to even more subtle clues than crazy intense thoughts.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say, for lack of a better word, what's the biggest mistake that you notice when you're working with people that are walking through healing anxiety and depression and healing in general?
Yeah, I would say the number one thing is the agenda of trying to fix ourselves. I honestly think that is one of our biggest hindrances, because as soon as I have the agenda of trying to fix my anxiety and fix my depression and fix my triggers, I'm no longer with myself anymore. I'm no longer seeking to understand. I'm no longer curious. I'm no longer wanting to be with and to have that felt experience with myself, because now I'm a problem that needs to be fixed, and I'm not okay until I get fixed. And just think about that in a friendship. If you're having a friendship with yourself, and that's your agenda for yourself. And that's why even when I have people go back to the early childhood developments, one of my favorite things is to say, who is that child? Not their pain, not their trauma, because almost every healing model goes back to trauma and pain and is ultimately communicating that your pain and trauma is more important than you. And when we recognize that we are not our pain and trauma, it does need to be comforted. It does need to be cared for. And my pain matters, but I matter more. Yeah. And that is the mindset and the posturing that creates so much healing in our hearts when we remove the barrier of trying to fix ourselves.
That was such a good answer. It is so, so absolutely true. The freedom I think that I experienced in letting go of a timeline for my healing was one of the best things that I could have done for my own
Yeah.
mental health and my own healing. So I wanted to do just two more things. The first thing is I was wondering if you could walk through like a very tangible, practical application of self-compassion for people like me who are like, okay, wait, like this is all great to talk about, but what do you do? And then I'll have one question at the end. So
Perfect.
Do you have a good example off the top of your head of like something you see commonly people struggling with when they first come to you?
Yeah, people feeling like they're the problem, like that's very common. Like when people come in, they feel like whatever they're going through in life, that they feel like they're the problem. So then they end up withholding self-compassion. It kind of goes back to what I just said about being fixed. They end up withholding compassion because they actually believe they're the problem. And so being able to help separate that is really important.
So like, what would be an example of somebody feeling like they're the problem? Would that be kind of like when I first came in saying like, I'm so anxious and I don't know why. I'm just like freaking out. I'm like,
exactly.
I don't know why I'm so anxious and like
exactly how you just said it. Even when you just said, I am so anxious. That's me. Like that's my identity, really. That's what people are saying. They're not saying it in those words, but they're saying, I am anxious.
Okay.
And so when you're in that place, that creates the barrier of being able to actually show them compassion or teach them how to show themselves the compassion. Because if you are the problem, you're not going to be very compassionate with yourself.
So if you have somebody that comes in and they say, I am so anxious. What is the first step that you would walk them through?
So the first step is exploring what their flavor of anxiousness feels like so that they get their own. Most people in their anxiety, they feel overwhelmed, out of control, small, helpless. Their external world feels much, much bigger than their internal world.
Yeah. Someone sitting across from you and they say, I feel so insecure around people, or I have a lot of social anxiety. When I'm around people, I just compare myself. I feel like everyone's doing better than me. I feel like this is something I hear a lot too. Everyone's creating really amazing big things, and I am like so behind. And I don't know why I can't do the things that I dream about doing. I just feel so insecure and so stuck. What would you say?
Mm-hmm. So then I would help them get to a more tender part in their hearts. So those would be their reactions, and they're real and they're valid, and they feel like they're behind. They feel like they're not enough. They feel like everyone else has it and they don't have it. But I can't persuade them. I can't tell them, no, you're amazing. That's what we try to do. Doesn't work. But what I can do, I try. I'm like, no, you're amazing. But nope, you cannot logic emotions. And so being able to bring connection to the more tender part of our heart that's feeling that. Because usually we're really sad that we don't feel like we have what it takes. We're really scared. We may never have what it takes. We really feel lonely and stuck because we don't feel like anyone's with us in this. So bringing them back to those more tender emotions, all of a sudden we're like, oh, this isn't actually about creating. This is about me feeling really sad because I don't know who I am and I don't know what to do. And then helping them come back to themselves, because when we feel those more tender emotions, it helps us connect with ourselves. So versus feeling like I am anxious, I can go to I am sad, not as my identity, but I feel sad. And when I feel that sad, it brings me back to myself, which I realize I'm still okay. Once you go through the process of it, I'm still okay. I'm enough. And when we're in that place of I'm enough, all of a sudden when they look back on not the comparison and not being able to move ahead and not being able to create, we realize, oh, it's not about being more. It's not about the hustle. It's not about success. Those things were all masking my true need to feel loved and seen and heard and comforted. And again, going back to that being with. So then the practicalness of being with is literally being able to put your hand on your heart and saying, I will be with you. We'll do this together. Whatever it is that pain spot is pressing on, I know you're scared. We'll find help. It's going to be okay. Simple connections with your heart in the more tender place versus trying to connect with yourself in the reaction.
Yes. Yes. So the trigger is, let's say I feel stuck in my creative process and I feel behind. The tender emotion is actually has nothing to do with that. It's more like I feel alone and I feel sad. I thought that creating something, maybe not consciously, but subconsciously, I guess I thought, creating something would maybe bring me the attention that I need, which shows me actually what's really going on is I feel lonely. So if you had somebody that was sitting across from you and they said, when you walk them all the way down to the bottom, I guess it just feel lonely. Then that's when we talk about bringing the imagination in, right?
And that's where we can bring real people, real experiences of I am seen. So now I don't need to create to be seen. I'm already seen because this man, this woman, this friend, this peer, this relative sees me. And I have the felt experience of being seen, and it fills up my loneliness. And I know I'm with. I know that person is with me. I know I'm with myself. And now I can create. It's extraordinary how all of a sudden energy comes back into you. And all of a sudden you have these ideas and all of a sudden you know you can do it. And it's just so wild to 5 minutes before you're like, we can do this. Or 5 minutes before you're like, I'm never going to be able to do this and it's never going to work.
Right, totally. I don't remember what my original triggers were when I came to, but I remember getting to the thing underneath. So letting go of the story, getting to the emotion underneath. And it was whatever it was, I don't remember. I feel really sad. And you would say well, let's bring someone in to be with you in that sadness, meaning that little girl part of you needs someone to be with her that's not afraid of her sadness, to be with her. And I remember saying to you, I can't think of anyone. No, there was no one. I can't think. What do you mean? And then as I worked with you, one of the very first memories that popped up for me was one of my mom's best friends used to pick me up from school when I was in 5th grade. And her name was Kathy. And she was so good at being with me like I was a real person she wanted to get to know and not just another kid in the carpool. Yeah. And she would let me sit in front and pick the music, and we would talk about music and we would talk about books. And she had a nickname for me, and she would always look me in the eye and laugh at my jokes. Mm-hmm. And so I remember Kathy was one of the first people that I brought in to be with me. And what I would do is I would try and remember how that felt to be in her presence, how I felt seen and loved and admired for just being me. And that's what you're talking about. This is the compassion method, tangibly, and it does start, I think, for a lot of people with there's no one I can ever remember. And that's what I love about the work that you do is you can really prove to anyone, actually, you've had more of those connections than you think you have.
Exactly. We just don't have eyes to see it or a heart to receive it.
Right. And when you bring them in, that's when we can begin to heal our experience.
I know. I love that. Even you just sharing your experience with a person that really cared for you and saw you and heard you. I mean, that's just so beautiful to have that. Even as you described it, I could feel the felt experience. And I even thought for myself, I was like, oh, that would have been fun to be with her, So it's we can actually improve that experience. One of the most impactful times I had when I was working with my child self, my 3-year-old self, and she really needed to be adored and cherished and seen and celebrated, is I was in a grocery store and I was watching a dad with his 3-year-old daughter, and he just adored her. You could feel the tangibility of how he looked at her, and her little eyes were just talking a mile a minute and just so happy and so just basking in adoring, basking in being chosen. And I looked at them, don't know them, never saw them again. And I looked at them and I said, baby girl, that's how daddies are meant to look at their little girls. That's for you. And I could just feel it. My 3-year-old could just feel it. And I was just that is a picture of, even though it wasn't directly happening to me, it was such a picture of being cherished and adored. And it literally felt like there was a light on them because it was so tangible in the connection that they were having.
And it is funny, even as you tell it, I feel like I can feel it. And that's what we're talking about. Yeah. We could get really technical. I love to get really technical. That's a somatic felt sense of connection that you're talking about. And you would call it something different. But that's that is what heals. That's why self-compassion is one of the most powerful things that we can learn.
Yeah.
So I just love you so much.
I know. Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
I have one last question for you. My question is, what is something that you are either healing in your life or creating with your life?
So right now I am wanting to write a book. So I am creating. I know, it's
Oh
really
my gosh.
exciting. I've actually wanted to write a book since I was like 8 years old. I used to like write
Oh,
stories and books from a little girl. They were like fictional books and stuff like that. But still,
yeah.
I've just always wanted to write a book. And my husband actually did write a book the last year that on Earth, he wrote a book and I was able to publish it for him. And I wrote a little bit there, but it was really challenging even to publish his work, even though it wasn't mine. So right now I'm trying to and going to create a book.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's kind of
That's
scary.
incredible. Oh my gosh. Well, that's a whole other podcast. I want to talk to you about what's scary about that.
Yeah.
But we'll just keep an eye out for your book that is bound to be incredible. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. And thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, if you guys want to find out more about what Laura does, you can find her on Instagram, right?
Yep.
At Laura Duncan Consulting. I think you also have a website, which is the same.
Same
name. Yeah. All right. Thanks. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.